Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Centre, London. Now, some may think of Nehru Centre as just this beautiful fine building, and it is a fine building, no doubt. We have a wonderful art gallery out here. We have an awesome auditorium on the first floor with a capacity of 100 to 120 people right here in the heart of central London in Mayfair. But the Nehru Centre is a lot more than this fine building. The Nehru Centre is also an online platform. We are available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram and on YouTube. And so the Nehru Centre is actually wherever you want it to be. Of course, we'd love for you to come to the physical events that we organize out here when we do organize them. But do join all our online platforms as well. This is a hybrid world. We are going to have offline physical events and online events as well. So do join our online platforms and do keep giving us feedback of what you think of it. We'd love to host you out there. We'd love to hear what you think of our events, and do keep sending in your suggestions as well. We do keep imbibing and learning from the feedback that you give to us to give you programs that you guys might enjoy. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste. Jai Hind. Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi, and as you can clearly make out, I am coming in from a different location. I'm in India right now, and we have to say that the event we are putting up today has got massive traction on social media. The moment we announced it, the conversation, the retweets, the repostings, it shot through the roof. And it's no surprise because Sai Deepak has written what is the number one non-fiction bestseller in India at the current moment. If we can call Sai Deepak up on stage, please.
Namaste, Amish ji.
Namaste, Sai. What a pleasure to have you on board at the Nehru Centre platform. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the book that we are launching here today. This is the international launch on the UK-based Nehru Centre platform. And for those of you who still haven't read it, shame on you guys. Just go to Amazon, go to your closest bookstore and pick it up. Sai, we are a Sarkari place, so we are going to have to do your formal introduction before we start the conversation. Sure. If you can give me the leave for that, please. Sai Deepak is an engineer turned lawyer practicing as an arguing counsel primarily before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi. A mechanical engineer from Anna University, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in law from IIT Kharagpur's law school in 2009 and has carved a niche for himself as a litigator in civil, commercial, and constitutional matters. Over the years, he's been a part of several landmark matters, such as the ones relating to the Shabrimala Ayyappa Ji temple, the Sri Padmanabha Swami temple, and the Basmati geographical indications. In 2019, he was awarded the Young Alumni Achievers Award by his alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. Apart from delivering lectures on law, he's a prolific writer on constitutional issues for leading newspapers and magazines. And now, of course, he's also number one non-fiction bestseller author. Sai, absolute pleasure to have you on our platform. And there's one more thing that we have to do before we start the conversation. Because this is an online event, we don't get the pleasure of wrapping papers, but we have put up a video to launch your video, an online launch of your book. If we can have that launch, please. The online launch of Sai Deepak's number one national bestseller.
Thank you, Amish ji. It's a pleasure to actually be with you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Absolute pleasure having you on board, buddy. Someone I'm a fan of. So it's a real pleasure to be
Very
in
kind of you.
conversation with you. Sai, if I can jump into something that is topical, albeit slightly controversial these days, the thing on who has the adhikar or the authority to write on history and historical matters and constitutional matters and social issues. Um, Apparently, there are some hoops that one has to jump through before one does that, and you have not jumped through those hoops.
Right. So I think it's very interesting because one, it shows that in a supposedly casteless world, we are being told that there is a hierarchy even in academia, and that one has to jump through a few hoops. And what those hoops are and how we jump across those hoops shall also be decided by guardians of knowledge. And this is precisely what the book in several portions speaks of, specifically, which is the geopolitics of knowledge itself, the control over portals of knowledge, portals of academia, and hallowed institutions. Uh, but coming to my own specific qualification to write on the topic that I have, the good part of being a lawyer is that while you're typically associated with legalese, you are expected to understand political science to a significant extent. You're also expected to understand how law interplays with culture and society as a part of your reading up of jurisprudence. So while we may not be trained historians, we may not be trained students of political science in the sense of pursuing exclusive degrees in each of these realms, we are expected to have a smattering of understanding of each of these areas, because you're an incomplete lawyer if you do not understand history, or at least if you don't have a sense of history or political science. So with that background, I chose to further equip myself with, at the very least, a basic amount of reading, and much more than basic reading. And I believe that ultimately let's say, the quality of a book, to a significant extent, if not entirely, is decided by the quality of reception and the scale of reception. So assuming that I hadn't earned my stripes to write the book before I authored it, I think the reception more or less validates the fact that I'm at least well positioned to qualify as a learner on these subjects as opposed to an expert as far as these subjects are concerned. And as far as the three sections are concerned, I make it abundantly clear that out of the three sections, I don the hat of a learner with respect to coloniality as well as civilization. But when it comes to the Constitution, also, I don't use the much abused word expert. I call myself someone who is a fair and a decent student of Constitution, and with perhaps a fair and decent aptitude for it. So that's where I stand, and I'm more than happy to be corrected if someone says that you weren't qualified to write this book in the very first place, because that will initiate the conversation which I've been waiting for, and it'll open the floodgates as to who decides this, where does this authority come from, who pulls the strings. So that's the answer.
Fair point, fair point. And the readers uh, tend to think that you do have the authority. It's already into the third print run, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Fantastic. That is really a fantastic performance. If
Thank you.
one can jump deeper into the civilizational issues that you raised, there's a discussion these days of looking at India, and you yourself refer to it in your book as well. You discuss it in a fair bit of detail of seeing India as a civilizational state, that we
Right.
are essentially we are different from the relatively modern concept of a nation state.
Right.
And perhaps the only pre-Bronze Age civilization, there is still a living culture. If you can take us through your thinking on this, why do you think this is? And if I can impose a few more questions as a corollary to this, that why do you think India as a civilization has survived? And we will discuss the two waves of colonization that we suffered, which is not
Right.
explored as deeply in our history books. We'll come to that. But why do you think we have survived? And what is the impact of this on the kind of state that we must be?
Right. So I'll take the second part of your question first, and perhaps therein lies the key to the first question as to why we qualify perhaps as a society which can claim to be a civilization state. One, I think we have significantly functioned as a federal civilization at the level of a society, which effectively has both, let's say, a unitary identity as well as a constituent identity, which is to say that there is a larger identity which uh, takes within its bosom multiple identities which are parts. And both feed off each other and both enrich each other. And that has been my understanding of the literature written by stalwarts of the late 20th century and early 21st century. So therefore, I'm standing on the shoulders of these giants who have understood the manner in which this particular society operates, what is its pathology, what is its psyche, much, much better than what I've seen so far. And therefore, I believe that more than any other society, given our scale of diversity and the richness of individual identities, and still the common train of unity that runs across these diverse identities, this is perhaps the best possible culture that can lay claim to the concept of a civilization. And because ultimately, while diversity certainly characterizes a civilization, for it to be treated as a single civilization, there must be some unity. And therefore, when we speak of unity and diversity, we are characterizing and we are speaking of the character of this particular society as a civilizational society. So that is the basic mold in which we've been operating. And the reason why I think we have survived is because of our inherent spiritual strength, which is rarely given credit for. And in fact, stalwarts have come to the conclusion that while the Christian concept of religion cannot be used to understand dharma, dharma is effectively what has kept this particular society alive and has kept it together as one unit, as a federated republic of sorts. And dharma's multiple manifestations is what allows local identities to thrive and survive. So, in other societies, if there is, let's say, one wave of colonization or one wave of invasion, the possibility of a domino effect is higher. But because this particular civilization also has multiple constituents which are held together by the concept of dharma, it is much more difficult to create a domino effect wherein you hope that if one aspect of the society falls, the rest of the society falls. That hasn't happened. So,
there's no one head to cut off in a way.
exactly, exactly.
There's
So therefore,
multiple
there is
backups.
a command and control structure on the basis
Yeah.
of which this is operated, and there is a significant degree of decentralization, which, apart from strengthening its civilizational character, has also made it significantly resilient to foreign invasions and foreign influences. And the strength of the civilization also is that wherever there is a possibility of assimilating and according other faith systems a respectable place within our society and making it part of our own tapestry, we have done so on the basis of knowledge structures, on the basis of, let's say, guna and karma, as opposed to simply using ethnocentrism or race as the basis for according status. So
Yeah.
our emphasis on knowledge, our emphasis on traits, our emphasis on fundamental human traits as opposed to race-based traits is what I think has kept us together. Which is why it is possible for a Harshavardhana who comes from, let's say, what we know as China today or certain parts of China to become ultimately part of Indian history. Okay. So the physical features, the diversity in food habits, none of these seem to have made a difference to our ability to
Sorry,
be
Kanish.
healthy.
Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Sorry,
You
did you
meant
mean Kanish? Yeah.
Kanish,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Kanish, not Harshavardhana. You're right.
Correct. Correct.
So,
Correct.
therefore, as far as this particular example goes, it clearly shows that we are open, but we also expect a fair bit of blending when one wants to settle in this particular society. So, which is why only those who have refused to become part of this particular society have typically created fault lines and fissures, so to speak. But otherwise, let me give perhaps a slightly more provocative example. It's not as if monotheistic faiths and Bharatiya faiths cannot live side by side, because at the end of the day, Jews also are a monotheistic community. Parsis also are a significant monotheistic community. Perhaps the earliest form of monotheism that the Middle East or the west of Bharat is aware of. And
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, you can hear
Yeah,
me?
I think
Yeah.
I lost you for a bit. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't think it's a
Yeah,
question
you're
of
on
whether,
Judaism. Yeah.
correct, on Judaism as well as on the Parsi faith or Zoroastrianism. I believe that it's been possible for all of us to coexist simply because we have put faith in the importance and centrality of coexistence and harmonious existence. So certain communities have been more than happy to give up on what they believe are essential tenets of their faiths in the interest of coexistence. That has happened. Okay, so I think this is Bharatiyata, which has been imputed and imparted to even those faith systems which don't come from this land. That I believe is the reason why we have survived. Now, coming to the central question of why we qualify as a civilizational state, I don't know if we still operate as a civilizational state, because the one distinction that I strike in the book is that merely because the society happens to be a civilizational society, the state that presides over such a society doesn't become a civilizational state automatically. It has to be conscious of its civilizational character. It has to conduct itself in a manner which is consistent with its profession of being a civilizational state, which must be reflected in its policies, which means language policy, which means identity policy, all sorts of policies. Are you in a position to craft policies which continue to strengthen the identities of the parts as well as keep the whole together? That is what ultimately defines you as a civilizational state. Whether we are still a civilizational state or not, I have not come to a conclusion on that, because that is left to the second book. I've just come out with the prescriptions of what qualifies as a civilizational state as far as Bharat is concerned, and I've limited myself to that position in the first book. Whether it translates to a civilizational state or not, from the perspective of the constitution, I'll address it only in the second book, which is book 2 of the Bharat trilogy.
Fair. And building a bit on your the answer that you put on a civilizational state, and this is something that I spoke on as well, the controversy around the legal controversy around subjects like Jallikattu or the Dahi Handi, the tradition in Maharashtra, the state.
Right,
My house is in Jallikattu, is from Tamil Nadu, the state you're from,
right,
or indeed the Shabrimalaji issue in the neighboring state, Kerala, where there is an attempt to impose, uh, I won't use the term one truth, but one approach across
correct,
what is a very diverse society. And of course, there tends to be resistance to that from society. How do you see such issues playing out? This question did get asked by one of the viewers as well. I'd request the technical team if that can be brought up. He discussed Shabrimalaji, but I see it as consistent
right, right,
across various issues. And would the traditional Indian approach be that if there's no other subject being harmed, then you celebrate diversity and let people follow their own? And there are, in the case of Shabrimalaji, for example, there are temples which are open only to women. Uh,
correct,
and India offers the space for multiple approaches to the divine, or indeed atheism also, if you choose to.
correct,
How do you
correct.
see this issue from the present state? If it's impinging into your second book, you don't need to answer that. But
No, no, absolutely.
uh, if how do you see the present state working on this as compared to how a civilizational state would approach such subjects?
So I believe that what we have ended up doing over the years is that we have slavishly imported certain values which we believe are universal values, and assume for a moment, even if a value is universal, definitions are rarely universal, because definition of a certain value must vary and typically varies from culture to culture based on its own cultural experience. And what we have done is that, apart from importing the value, we have also imported the definition itself. And in the case of the examples that you've just cited, the weaponization of a monochromatic approach to the concept of equality is perhaps the single biggest reason for the harmonization and the attempted standardization of religious practices that we are witnessing across the board. And no arm of the state is an exception to this particular tendency at this point, because that
This
is where
thing,
I
so
believe.
if I may add
Yeah,
one thing to it, this thing that I've read in some of the courts, you're a Supreme Court lawyer, you know that where is it written? They keep
Right.
asking that if it's a ritual, it must be written. Whereas the traditional Indian approach has been Shastrat Rudir Balyasi, that
Correct.
traditions or rituals can be more important than the text.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In
There's
fact, I've
respect to the practices of
correct.
the masses. Sorry, go ahead,
Correct.
please.
In fact, you've just touched on the nub of the issue that I've discussed in a certain portion of the book, where I explain how the Judeo Abrahamic obsession with the written word, which comes from their respect for the book, is transposed onto Indian traditions. And therefore, what is otherwise perhaps a descriptive recordal of customs become a law book. And
Mm,
Shastras become, let's say, the fount of law, as opposed to, for instance, in fact, I was reading a commentary. In fact, I was watching a commentary by this giant of a scholar from the south, Sri Manidravida Shastri, who
mm,
typically speaks on Shastras and who's a legend on this particular subject, a stalwart on this particular subject, who says that even Shastras at the end of the day cannot be
mm,
treated as law. It merely says if you were to follow this particular principle, you're
mm,
aiding the cosmic balance. And
mm,
therefore, Rita is preserved if this particular approach were to be adopted.
mm,
Beyond that, should you choose to ignore it, the choice is entirely yours, but the consequences are also yours to bear. That's effectively
mm.
the Shastri position. Okay.
Which is
So
liberalism, if you think about it.
exactly, exactly.
Which is what
So, which
liberalism
is why
is.
this is not something that can be treated in the same nature or at par with, let's say, a biblical mandate, or let's say an Old Testament mandate, or let's say a Quranic
Mm,
mandate in that particular sense. And
mm,
as you rightly pointed out, the reason why achara or custom or tradition is sometimes and more often than not given more importance than the shastra or the written word itself is because achara is effectively seen as the idea in action on the ground. And if the idea
mm,
in action on the ground has proven itself over a certain point of time, that becomes
mm,
received wisdom, which is not to be tampered with, even if it goes against the written word.
mm,
Therefore, tradition itself and unwritten tradition itself is part of our religious tapestry. Unlike, let's say, Abrahamic religions, where what does not exist in the book is not part of religion. Okay. And this is where the entire problem comes about when Indian courts also apply this very same book based approach to Indian traditions and Indian institutions, because this is what results in creating the test called the essential practices test or the non essential practices test.
mm,
Only those practices which are supported in a scripture and which are deemed as central to a particular institution are worthy of protection under the law, and those
mm,
which are not supported by the book are ultimately deemed as superstition or superfluous and therefore do not have the protection of the law. That's
mm,
exactly the problem either with Dahi Handi or, let's say,
mm,
Sabarimala or any of these institutions. So the
mm,
Abrahamization of your approach to Hindu philosophy, to Hindu institutions, is
mm,
primarily, I would say, the reason, and this is the reason why even the judiciary fails to wrap its head around our own concepts, because they don't
mm,
subscribe to our concepts anymore. They need the
mm,
book, they need written evidence, they need everything that is documented. So oral testimony, oral traditions, oral philosophies, and let's say the fact that you have a smriti and everything that is primarily oral. So someone who learns
mm,
Rudram or, let's say, Vishnu Sahasranam, the first thing they are told is that please don't read the book and chant.
mm.
Try and listen and
Right.
try and memorize it as much as possible purely on the basis of the sound, because we value the shabda or the sound as much. I think there's a fundamental
Mm,
difference in ontology on the particular aspect. So I believe
mm,
that's exactly why we are looking at a calibrated and continuous monochromatization of our traditions because of this Judeo-Abrahamic and therefore colonial lens that is approached and let's say that is adopted with respect to our institutions. That is what I'm trying to address in the book significantly.
If I can challenge you a bit, say from
Yes.
putting on a different hat, what happens when there are some traditions which have become negative, which
Right.
uh, keep some people oppressed,
Right.
um, and therefore those traditions should be challenged.
Right.
Um, and if you have a situation like this, Shastra Drudir Balyasi, then you cannot challenge the rituals. Having said that, there is a question of challenging, the books as well, in case there
Right.
are some of those traditions which don't bear out. But I'm saying from this perspective, if there are some traditions which do need to be challenged. And I'm sure we
Right.
can agree there are some which should be
Correct.
challenged.
Right.
Um, how does your viewpoint play out in that case?
So let's take an uncomfortable example and apply this question to that example, and therefore let's go to untouchability as an example. Okay.
Hmm.
Assume for a moment that untouchability were to be still around,
Hmm.
and then someone says this is prescribed by the Shastras and
Hmm.
therefore it cannot be interfered with.
Hmm.
Then the question would be, how does one balance, let's say, commonsensical and perhaps a legitimate concern about keeping such a practice alive in this day and age, which also results in significant dignitary harm to people who are, let's say, bearing the brunt of that particular practice?
Hmm.
And how do you, let's say, what instrumentality of the state can interfere with it?
Hmm.
On this question, I have
Because it
actually
should be
had the
challenged, as
correct,
as it was, as it
correct,
should be.
correct.
Should be.
So there, my entire position has been twofold, which is
Hmm.
that if you see how untouchability was ultimately abolished, one, it started off with the Vaikom Temple entry movement in the 1930s,
Hmm.
where, let's say, you had independence leaders as well as Maharajas of princely state, predominantly the Maharaja of the princely state of Travancore taking the lead,
Hmm.
Sri
Hmm.
Chitra Tirunal Balarama Varma,
Hmm.
along with the then Diwan of the Travancore princely state, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. And these
Hmm.
were all supposed to be staunch Hindus and, dare I say, even Brahminical in today's parlance. Okay.
Hmm.
These were the ones to take the initiative to open
Hmm.
the temple to the depressed classes and the then, let's say, Harijans or people who were treated as untouchables.
Hmm.
And the reason why this is such an important example, it points out that there is a moral compass within this particular society which is inherent. And
Hmm.
you must be fair to give that society an opportunity to look forward and decide for itself whether a practice has contemporary purchase or not. So that's one. And therefore, you cannot and should not take a paternalistic approach to this particular society, because that is the approach of the colonizer. Because he
Hmm.
constantly says, I will educate you because you don't know better. My
Hmm.
point is, my people have known better and they have a conscience in place. And they are capable of taking a decision in the interest of humanity and dignity. Point
Hmm.
number three, which is the question of challenge.
Hmm.
Please, here's where I think it gets slightly technical, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible.
Hmm.
My point has never been that a societal practice must always be left untouched. My point has
Hmm.
been, is judiciary the organization or the institution that is supposed to do this?
Hmm.
Because judiciary is not an elected body.
Hmm.
Okay. It does not have institutional training to understand some of our practices, because institutionally it is not trained in religion. It is supposed to be a secular institution.
Hmm.
Okay. Three, your language of communication when you happen to be in the judiciary is significantly English.
Hmm.
And colonial linguistics and colonial semantics prevent you from understanding the practice for what it is. I'm not saying justify it. I'm just saying, even to appreciate it on its own merits, you're not
Hmm.
capable of doing so. And therefore, you need someone with the training of the subject to make a point on this. So,
Hmm.
for instance, in the United States or even in United Kingdom, whenever there's a matter of religion that ends up going before the court of law,
Hmm.
the court typically defers to who is treated as the expert on that particular subject as a matter of religion. So, a representative of the church, or let's say someone, a practitioner of theology, or a trained professor of theology, is presented as the expert witness.
Hmm.
These are not practices that the Indian Supreme Court or any constitutional court has adopted so far, because they
Hmm.
significantly fall back on their own training. But you clearly can't be the expert on everything from gynecology to religion to theology to ethnology. That can't happen. Okay.
Hmm.
If you're willing to listen to a handwriting expert on issues of handwriting evidence, surely you should listen to a religious expert on matters of religion. Okay, that's the basic answer. Second,
Hmm.
as opposed to the judiciary, the
Hmm.
legislature and the government can initiate such discussions, because the what is the assumption? They have been elected, therefore there is a popular mandate, and they are
Hmm.
expected to be in touch with the people, and therefore they can at least initiate a discussion with the people on the need for reform with respect to certain practices which do not have a place.
Hmm.
Okay. So my point has not been, please leave everything untouched and everything should be justified in the name of Shastras. I
Hmm.
am saying, first of all, the Shastras themselves don't operate in that particular fashion. And
Hmm.
secondly, the body or the forum where this particular discussion must happen is between the state and the elected body, not the state and a handful of unelected people, namely the judiciary. That's been my
Hmm.
limited position. And in light of the fact that we abolished untouchability through Article 17 through our own cogitations, it's
Hmm.
always been a legislative process combined with societal cogitation that has resulted in removal of these practices, but not judicial interference. As someone who practices before the Supreme Court, I am asking for respecting the red lines painted by the Constitution with respect to the boundaries within which the judiciary operates. Because when the judiciary does this, and then this becomes the law, what is the recourse ultimately to the society to appeal against a wrong decision? What do you do then? You are left with no other option but to observe the rule and breach, which effectively results in contempt. Okay. So that is exactly why you saw that, notwithstanding the verdict of the Sabarimala bench, the 4-1 judgment, the women of Kerala did not accept it because they said, sitting in Delhi, you have not been able to understand the nature of this practice. And we are a fundamentally matriarchal society, and you're telling us that an institution that is dedicated to a Naishthika Brahmachari, a celibate male deity, is not even entitled to place restrictions with respect to entry of women of reproductive age group. Not all women. Okay, clearly then there is a reasoned basis for that particular restriction. So that tells us that while popular opinion cannot always prevail over logic and reason, sometimes you must make an effort to understand the sentiment behind popular opinion, because it's not always wrong. Merely because something is popular doesn't mean that it is bound to be incorrect or, let's say, mob based. The tendency to treat popular opinions as some kind of mobocracy is something that I think we are missing the point. Because if that is the case, let's not even have a democracy, because ultimately it's the majority's rule which translates to democracy. Okay. So my problem has been with respect to the institution where these discussions can happen, and not with respect to whether there should be a discussion on the subject.
Fair point. And then if even through the legislature or elected body processes, the Indian people have rolled out the largest affirmative action program in the history of humanity, something which the West has not done to date. We know how the Roma are treated in Europe, or African Americans,
Or gypsies for that
in
matter.
the US, or the Roma gypsies in Europe, and they're still treated terribly in most European countries. You spoke of coloniality, and I want to ask you something basis, and you can choose to be careful in the answer. I don't want you to get into a contempt situation or anything, but there was a speech recently by an honorable judge on the importance of English in judicial processes. There are some of
Senior Advocate Fali Nariman's speech.
Okay. So, what is your view on that subject? Even those who often in India who may have learnt English at school still think in our own languages, and therefore may not be completely comfortable with it. But there is an approach that some international concepts can come in because of English. What's your view on that subject? And is that a colonial approach, or is that something we shouldn't worry about too much? What's your feeling?
For the benefit of your audience, let me summarize the highlights of his speech so that I explain what my position is. He was basically speaking on what are the attributes of a good lawyer, what makes for a good lawyer in this country. And therefore, he was basically saying you must have a good command or grasp over English as a language, because that is the predominant language of transaction in Indian courts. And second, you must know English law really well, because all our concepts of equality and principles of equality, all of this comes from English law. And therefore, without a significant understanding of both English as a language and English law, it will be difficult for you to climb the ladder in the legal profession, is the point that he was making. The thing is, he was obviously making a point which is the reality as far as India's practice realities are concerned. That's a fact. Okay. And therefore, it doesn't show his coloniality, but it actually shows the coloniality of the system itself. Okay. It requires you to dye yourself in the English wool, if I may put it in those terms, for you to be able to survive in the system, and for you to actually make it and arrive in the system as a lawyer of repute and standing. Okay. So this encapsulation of what are the attributes of a good lawyer in Bharat, spelt out by one of the foremost jurists this country has produced and one of the finest senior advocates this country has seen, actually captures the problem of coloniality, which the book speaks about. Because that tells us that this is how the system has evolved. The system, as we know, is obviously a legacy of the British colonizer. And the circumstances that we have created thereafter have only pushed and entrenched that particular notion that without knowledge of English, you cannot survive in the legal system, or at the very least, you can't hope to practice before high courts and the Supreme Court. You can at best limit yourself to the district courts and the session courts, which is the reality to a significant extent. Now, I'll take this to a slightly more provocative level because a few years ago, one gentleman wanted to make his arguments before the Supreme Court, before a former Chief Justice of this country in Hindi. And he was told that this is the Supreme Court of India, and the only language in which you are permitted to speak and submit is English and no other language.
I
Okay?
didn't know this. My God. Okay.
Imagine that you can't even submit in Hindi before the Supreme Court of India because it is not the Supreme Court of Bharat, it is the Supreme Court of India. Okay? And therefore, there is a clear need to look at our language policies. And I'm happy to at least say that the very same institution has started making observations of the last few months or of the last few weeks, wherein the heads of this institution have clearly started saying that we need to be able to indigenize, Indianize, and decolonialize our institutions. Okay, especially the legal institution. So I'm happy that finally this particular statement and this sentiment is being expressed. I just hope that we move beyond expression of interest and it translates to concrete policies where people can actually try and submit in other languages. Now, the moment you make this particular submission, the first thing that comes about as an objection is, भारत में इतनी सारी भाषाएं हैं. How does one Supreme Court actually operate? Will it not create operational issues? Then my question is, how do you think the European Court of Justice functions? Obviously, it doesn't have a single language. Okay? And given the linguistic chauvinism prevalent in Europe, no particular country will tolerate the imposition of any other language on themselves, especially when it comes to legal processes. Okay? Such being the case, when a multilingual Europe can effectively survive on the basis of multiple languages, creates a vast linguistic ecosystem for transactions, creates a multiple let's say huge network of interpreters, translators, and whatnot, and has more than one language to be operated in as the official language. What stops Bharat from actually doing this? The point is, Bharat compares itself with a single European nation state as opposed to Europe as a continent. Okay, which is what the legitimate comparison would be in terms of diversity. And that is exactly why this loops back to the conversation of Bharat being a civilizational state. Every European state is a nation state, but Europe is a civilization. Bharat is a civilization and therefore must think like a civilization, including with respect to its language policy. This is the practical application of how a civilizational state would apply language policy to further its civilizational character, as opposed to reducing it to a monochromatic character, not even imposing Hindi, but English.
Fair point. Fair point. And I think the comparison with Europe as a whole is well made. I mean, our states are equivalent to a European nation state. You can see the compliments coming in, but guys, if there are any questions, please feel free to push them up. Sai is with us for at least 20 minutes more, and I'm sure he'll answer the question. Sai, if I may challenge you a bit on the point you made on coloniality. You made a fair point that that we need to decolonize ourselves. We need to to become more indigenous. But you yourself in your book, when you're quoting examples on scholarship, you start with Latin American scholarship, not with traditional Indian scholarship. How do you explain this dissonance?
I'm so grateful for this question because the hint to this actually lies in the subtitle of the book itself. Okay, the subtitle of the book is Coloniality, Civilization, Constitution. The thought process was to basically show that civilization as a construct, and especially Indic civilizational consciousness, is stuck between coloniality and the contemporary vehicle of coloniality, which is the Constitution. So that was the thought process behind it. Now, the reason why I structured the book in such a manner, wherein I start with Latin American scholarship first and then juxtapose it with Indian scholarship on the subject of colonial consciousness, is because I am operating under the belief that since I'm dealing with a society which is happy to follow the white man when it comes to issues of scholarship, Let me use that particular sentiment against the reader and cite Western scholarship itself, which shows what are the origins of coloniality. Because if I were to start with Indian scholarship, which has been saying this all along, that the colonization project goes hand in hand with the evangelization project. If I had made that particular statement, I'd be immediately accused of fascism, xenophobia, because obviously this shouldn't have been xenophobia because it's not a question of race, but still that would have been hurled at me. All sorts of ad hominem attacks would have come my way. So I said, let's do something better. I will show you what the so called West has been saying about its own conduct. And then I'll juxtapose it against or with the Indian scholarship on the subject and ask you a simple question. Why is it that you have a greater degree of respect for Western scholarship on the same subject? And when it is applied specifically in the context of Bharat by Bharatiya scholars, you start labeling it as, let's say, fascist, so on and so forth. Why do you do that? So I'm trying to use that mentality of the reader, the average reader, against his own beliefs to try and expose the hypocrisy in his own thinking. And therefore, I'm holding the mirror to the reader that this is how I wish to reverse the gaze. Therefore, in a specific portion, I think in the opening chapter of the second section of the book that deals with civilization, after having discussed the entire Western scholarship and coloniality, I then say, now this is exactly why I started with Western scholarship, because now I'm going to ask you the simple question that if this is what coloniality has done to at least four continents across the world, why do you expect a different treatment and a different sentiment the moment the colonizer enters Bharat? It's not as if he thought Bharat is a Punya Bhumi and the moment he set foot on Bharat soil, he had a change of heart and conscience. He had the very same objectives. He had the very same goals. He employed the very same strategies. In which case, why do you credit the colonizer's benevolence for my survival as opposed to my own resistance and inherent strength? I should be getting the credit for surviving, not him, right? As opposed to asking this question, what is so great about this civilization which has survived the ravages of two massive waves of colonization? We are asking the dumb question, what is so wrong about this civilization that we continuously were losing to one invader after another, which is not the case. Okay. So there is a
Actually,
standard.
our story is in the last 1,000 years is a story of heroic resistance. The only one who
Absolutely
survived.
successful.
The only one.
Absolutely successful
All
resistance.
practically all other ancient cultures were wiped out across the world.
Wiped out. Correct. So typically in judo, there is a trick. If the opponent happens to be heavier than you try to use his weight against himself. Okay. So I am saying, assuming that Indian scholarship is the lightweight scholarship and Western scholarship is the heavyweight scholarship, fine. Then I'll use the heavyweight scholarship to make my point. And most importantly, I wanted this particular book to go beyond the shores of Bharat so that Indian readers are exposed to Western scholarship on coloniality, and Western readers or global readers are exposed to Indian scholarship on colonial consciousness, so that they know that we have been saying the very same thing and we have been branded as xenophobic, illiberal, and fascist all along. And therefore, the double standards which are prevalent across borders must come out.
The decolonizing mission, I have kind of two questions on this because it's not just in the field of constitution or the judiciary, it's everywhere. I mean, something as basic as the number of seasons that taught to us in our education system. India actually has 6 seasons, but our education system teaches us that we have 4 seasons, which is
Four
actually the
seasons.
number of seasons in Europe, for crying out loud. Something as basic as this is so nonsensically attached to Europe. Um, how how does one decolonize? Because it's like it's almost everywhere, right?
Right.
It's like one is a part of the matrix. You don't even realize that actually everything is infected by it. The buildings that we build are copies
Correct.
of European buildings. A glass wall building makes sense in a Western
Right.
European country with too little sun. In India,
Correct.
you build a giant microwave oven with a because there is too much sun, not too little sun in India.
Correct. Correct.
A, how does one decolonize in every part? B, what's your prognosis? Where do you see this journey going? Are you hopeful? Are you troubled?
So let me come to the aspect of Asha and Nirasha, and then I'll go to the specifics. Uh, I must tell you that among the first authors uh, who successfully breached the perception barrier in the all important realm of pop culture by bringing in our, let's say, concepts, happens to be the interviewer of this particular session. Okay. So, considering that, I'm someone who believes that beyond our individual efforts, there is always something up in the air, and the universe constantly moves in a certain direction. It's for us to actually read the signs. Okay. Your arrival, then people like Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, and all these people started gaining traction. You know, and I know that the previous generation had the rough end of the stick. Okay. When they were trying to put out genuine scholarship, they were pushed to penury, they were pushed to infamy and whatnot. They were completely marginalized. Okay. And so that particular generation has done what I would call the Vishapanam. Okay. It has actually swallowed the poison. Okay. And this generation continues to swallow the poison, but to a significantly lesser extent. Okay. Thankfully, because there are tools of internet and whatnot, where there's a democratization of opinion that's possible, and there's a shaping of opinion that is possible. And therefore, we are reaping the benefits of that. So my point is, clearly something is afoot, and there is a gradually enlarging captive audience to these thoughts, both in the realm of pop culture, in the realm of fiction, in the realm of non-fiction, everywhere. Okay. And therefore, I draw hope from the fact that uh, it can only go up from here, it can't go down. क्योंकि इससे नीचे और कैसे जा सकते हैं. Okay. So हम नीचे थे और यहीं से ऊपर ही जाना पड़ेगा, because if this is, let's say, a bell curve, I think we are on the ascent at this point. Okay. And hopefully this process will continue for some time. And therefore the job is to try and create more people and groom more people in terms of creating an institutional mechanism. So I draw hope from that. 5 years ago, I don't think people would have spoken on the question of temple freedom. Today, there's a huge chorus of voices on this particular subject. 5 years or 6 years ago, I don't think I would have been able to reach out to a vast cross section of youngsters on subjects such as these. Not just me, so many people. And since the youth have started showing a significant degree of interest in these topics, and they've started taking to your books, everybody's books, they've started reading, that tells me that you're investing in the right demographic, which is the most important and the all critical demographic. Okay. So there's a very realistic basis for my sense of hope that the tide has started turning to some extent, and we are turning the corner for the better. That's my answer to the second part of your question. Now, coming to the practicalities of the exercise of decoloniality. Now, here my answer is going to be slightly more guarded, because we have to realize that the entire world stands integrated in the European system or the Western normative system. Almost. Okay. There may be a few islands in, let's say, Middle East or elsewhere, but anybody else is significantly operating within the rules that the West has formulated at least a century ago. Okay, whether it's with respect to the military industrial complex, or with respect to economics, or what constitutes development, what is the first world, what is the third world, all these questions, we are still addressing it in the European paradigm, which tells us that even the best of decolonial societies are still within the European mold. Okay. So what are we then looking at? I am looking at a hybrid future. Okay. We are still in a hybrid future. We will still move towards the hybrid future. The question will be, what will be the blend of this hybridity? Okay. The current blend of hybridity is significantly tilting towards westernization and hence modernization as defined by the European or the Westerner. Okay. And the hope is that we will move towards greater multilateralism and pluralism in the realm of culture as well as in the realm of politics. Okay. And therefore, a decolonial movement by a huge machine, a huge society called Bharat, is bound to create a domino effect, at least in the East, where you're looking at a hybridity which significantly skews in favor of indigeneity. Okay. It's impossible for us to completely throw it off. At least I don't have the farsight and, let's say, the vision to say कि इतने सालों में ये हो जाएगा. And I see the West still having a significant degree of say, at least for another 50, 60 years. Let's see what happens after that. But at least for 50, 60 years. But these 50, 60 years, while they may continue to have a certain degree of dominance, they are looking at an increased rate of cession of space. They are looking at losing ground to the East. And that they themselves are aware of. Whether it's China or Bharat or other countries put together, Europe is going to see a plateauing of its ability to remain at the top, and it is going to start ceding space in all let's say, departments. So I am basically putting hope in the fact that if we were to invest in rigorous scholarship and come out with policy formulations and policy prescriptions, we can hope to move towards a hybridity that is significantly in favor of Bharatiya indigeneity. And maybe there are certain aspects which you may have to retain in the interest of engaging with the rest of the world. But beyond that, I certainly believe that that hybridity is much better than the current self-loathing hybridity that we are currently living in. That needs to go.
No, fair point, fair point. Because uh, when if there are good thoughts that can be absorbed from the West, they should be
Correct.
absorbed. But some of the things that one sees happening in the West, the breakdown of family, the breakdown of community structures, seeing every festival as just an excuse to shop, commercialization
Correct.
of everything. It doesn't make a society happy.
Correct.
One can see that, you know. And those are things
Correct.
one should guard against. But there are some very good things that we should learn from. If we can jump into some audience questions, there was a question from DR saying, "What is your?" Okay, there was an earlier question. Sai, I'll come to that too. That what is the personal story behind the book? What triggered you to learn so much about European history and therefore on this book? But he had another. Yes, there is the question. So, what is the inspiration behind this book? What's the personal story behind this book? What made you research European history so deeply?
So this is one of those books where the introduction is semi-autobiographical, where I explain the triggers and the motivations behind the book. And I start with my own transition from engineering to law. A mechanical engineer who aspired to specialize in aerospace engineering ultimately went on to do law for a very specific reason. And were those triggers, let's say, on college campuses and in peer circles? I've explained that. But if I were to actually summarize it in, let's say, in Anand Ranganathan style 30-second capsule, I would basically say that I believed, and even if I say so with a certain degree of modesty and immodesty, that I had the skill sets to contribute to a certain point of view. And I did not want to be someone who stood or sat on the sidelines while all of this was happening and reading up the newspaper and whining about it after dinner over what I would call a post dinner katha kalakshepam. Okay. I wanted to contribute to something. If you feverishly believe in whining about something, at least have the conviction to do something about it. Okay. And to do something about it, my style of operation is that if you want to speak on something, read up and train and equip yourself on something before you talk about it. Or listen to people who are better qualified. That humility, which is the Indic trait, which is what our knowledge systems effectively treat, is something I strongly believe in. You should have the humility to sit at someone's feet and grasp everything that they have to offer. And even if if you have questions, they must come from a point of humility and not arrogance. So therefore, I decided to qualify myself in the law because I said humanities is where we seem to have a lot of problem, and law seemed to let's say I felt as if my atma was entering the sharir the moment I made the switch to law, and I felt I finally arrived at the right place.
A
And
beautiful way to put it. Beautiful way to
so
put it.
thank you. This book was waiting to happen at some point, but the triggers from 2018 to 19, or in fact 2020, were significantly the reason. Starting from the Sabarimala verdict to the Padmanabha Swamy verdict to the tectonic developments of Article 370, CAA, everything, and the reactions to it told me that it's time that we started talking about the Constitution and its relationship with the civilization, because the civilizational battle was being fought on the battlefield of the Constitution. Okay. And therefore, it was extremely important to undertake a rigorous analysis of both the relationship between the two. And I said, if you've practiced the subject and you've applied it in courts, and you know what is the reception to certain civilizational positions or Indic positions, then it's time that you start identifying what the problem is. And the analysis of the problem led me to the scholarship of colonial consciousness and coloniality, and hence the solution of decoloniality. This is the long and short of the story.
Fascinating. There was a question from Suhas Kaleji, if I can ask that. Judging by his picture, he is an older person, so I will. So Suhas ji has asked a question that how can we change the hybridity that you mentioned, Sai, to a positive balance of decolonization and civility with our ancient culture, civilizational influence. There's an important point Suhasji makes. One of the things that I individually, don't tend to like is modern debating. There's a lack of civility, a lack of manners, think to unnecessarily name call cuss words to those that one disagrees with, and that's not a positive approach. Um,
Right.
but we still must, everyone who has a point of view must make that put across that point of view. Being civil does not mean becoming a doormat. So, how do you find that balance? What do you feel?
It's an extremely pertinent question because lack of civility is one of the reasons that I typically avoid even participating in primetime discussions, primetime television debates, because you're expected to shout and indulge in shouting matches. But let me say this with a fair degree of real politic at play, that when you hope to unseat an, let's say, a power which has been entrenched for, let's say, 5 centuries now, don't expect the reactions to be civil or remotely, let's say, polite, because they don't want to be dislodged. They don't want to be told that their time is up. Okay. And therefore, the reactions will be as brutal as it gets. And therefore, I think it's for us to, let's say, I don't want to use the phrase man up because then I'll be accused of misogyny. I'll simply say that it is for us to actually tighten the loins and basically say, get ready for a fight because this is not going to be easy. The only thing that you can hope is that you shall conduct yourself in a manner that is consistent with dharmic ethos, which means if a civil reaction begets a civil reaction, then you stick to that line of approach. But if a civil reaction begets an uncivil reaction, then dharma says respond to it in a manner that it understands and respond to it in a language that it understands. Because as much as we try and have these conversations in perfumed, air conditioned atmospheres, the fact of the matter is, you know this better than I do, Amishji, that the politics of academia is perhaps worse than national politics. Okay, because there are huge inflated egos everywhere. And our dear friend Sri Vikram Sampath, the scholar who's just put out a wonderful series, a tome on Veer Savarkar, is just bearing the brunt for putting out rigorous scholarship and for putting the truth out in public domain, which tells us that established powers and established guardians do not like this one bit. So, while I certainly appreciate the expectations of civility, I think I've long lost that innocence and naivete to expect civility in these debates. Okay. So I don't operate from those notions anymore. I will do whatever it takes to put the truth out, at least to the best of my ability. And in the process, I'll try to be as civil as I can because that's my upbringing and that's my culture. But if that is taken as a sign of weakness, well, Shatra is something that Dharma teaches. We'll respond.
Okay, fair point. There was an interesting question from Aditi Desai, if I remember the name correctly, if that can be put up. Something on what can lay individuals do. From memory, if I recall, Sai, if I may ask you that, Aditi Desai, she asked that what can individuals do for this
Right.
very important cause, very important civilizational journey.
So I'll draw from one of the points that you made and one of your criticisms against the West, which is that please hold on to the family structure, believe in it, and realize that the next generation learns its values first from the family. And therefore, it is the first line of defense in growing a filter to deal with everything else outside. Therefore, the decolonial filter to deal with the external coloniality comes from the family. And the only way that the family does this is, first of all, by insisting on speaking at least in the mother tongue within the confines of the home as much as possible. The child must know the mother tongue. The child must be able to read in it, must be able to write in it. There are cognitive advantages for this, but more than that, I'm looking at cultural importance, not just cognitive advantages. And it's important for them to be exposed to that particular literature. Now, why should they be exposed to that particular literature? Is because literature written in Indic languages, at least in the 18th and 19th centuries, were the gold standard of scholarship because they were as blunt and truthful as they could get. And when you compare those versions of history with the sanitized versions which are then presented in English, you get to see what kind of dilution history has gone through when, let's say, there's a loss in translation between Indian languages and English. Okay. So I think it's important for them to be exposed to that. And when you're exposed to your own mother tongues, you're exposed to the universe of your culture through the idioms, through the proverbs, and ultimately language is the carrier of history. So you understand, you try and understand where all of this comes from. And there is not a single Indian language which doesn't have a reference from either the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. Okay.
Yeah.
So automatically you will have to ask yourself, where is the simile of a squirrel contributing a pebble coming from? Okay. You'll have to ask these questions. So therefore you'll be exposed to that. Three, the least that let's say a dharmic or an Indic family can do is to take an active interest in a place of worship closest to it, and take an active interest in the running of its affairs, and contribute to it significantly, and use the temple as the nerve center for dissemination of cultural values, and try and make it as useful as possible for those who do not have resources. These are things which at a very local level every person and every family can do, because not everybody needs to have a macro solution to a macro problem. Sometimes macro problems have micro solutions. Okay. And once this movement starts, you're looking at a much more informed and less colonialized audience, which would then be in a much better position to come out with solutions. Assume for a moment, so I gave this example recently. In cricket, you had to move from, let's say, a Kapil Dev to an Azharuddin, then you had to move to Saurav Ganguly, and today you have a Virat Kohli. There's a serious, let's say, difference in confidence. And similarly, in politics, you had to move from Shama Prasad Mukherjee, then you had to go to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, then Advani ji lost in 2009, and then ultimately you got Narendra Modi in 2014, and look at the change in confidence. So in civilizational battles, confidence is it's bound to increase with every generation. So have a fairly long-term vision and have a certain degree of patience. Start doing those things which are within your control, and hope that your next generation has what it takes to preserve this culture and take it forward, and that they're much more enthused to read up about their culture than we were. That's the hope. That's the least that we can do.
Fascinating as always. It's wonderful to hear you, Sai. And if I may ask one final question, impose one final question. I know we've taken a bit more of your time, and I know you have another event. Right, you have been really busy traveling all over the country promoting your book. Um you have said already that this is the first in a trilogy. So what can we expect going forward on the second and third book, and by when do you hope to release them?
So, if all goes well, by the grace of the gods, and gods in plural, the second book should hopefully come out by the middle of next year, that is in June 2022. So, the writing
Okay.
schedule is underway. The Sri Ganesh has already been done, so I've started.
Nice.
And this book will effectively cover the period between. So, the first book covers the period from 1492 to 1919, which was when the first British made constitution for Bharat was introduced. The second book will cover the period from 1920 to 1951, when you had the second constitution for Bharat, which is the 1935 Government of India Act, followed by the
Right.
Constitution of 1950, and the first amendment that was effected to the Constitution, where free speech was restricted by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru along with Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar in 1951. So that period will be covered. The third book should hopefully come out in 2023, where I shall hopefully cover the period between the first general elections of 1952 until the pronouncement of the Ram Janambhoomi judgment on 9th of November 2019. So that's the tentative outer limit for the third book, but I may change my mind depending on how the second book is received and what I wish to cover further. But this is the broad conspectus and scope of the Bharat trilogy.
I can't wait, Sai. As I've said often, I think you're one of the finest minds around in India today.
That's very kind of
And
you.
one of the, no, I genuinely believe that. And one of the key things I think in debate and discussions is to hear different points of view, and one doesn't seek a mirror of your exact views, because then what's the point? You don't learn anything. You
Correct.
must hear different points of view. Many you agree with, some you disagree with, and that's how you grow. That's how you learn. And you follow that approach as well, which is what convinces me that you're a fine practitioner and symbol of the traditional Bharatiya way. More
Thank you.
power to you. May Lord Shiva, or if you're not a Shaivite, then whichever gods and
I'm an Iyer,
goddesses you
therefore a
worship.
Shaivite.
Okay, there you go. Har Har Mahadev.
Har Har
So,
Mahadev.
may Lord Shiva continue to bless your pen, and looking forward to your next books. And thank you once again for
Thank you so
coming on
much,
the
Amish.
Bestseller platform.
And thanks to your entire team and Nehru Center for giving me this platform. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.